A single glance that shattered everything. Ethan Grayson had built an empire, but one shocking revelation changed it all. Ethan Grayson, a name that had long been synonymous with power, prestige, and control, had everything he ever wanted. From the top floor of his Manhattan skyscraper, he looked down on a city that had bowed before his every move. CEO of Grayson Capital, he had built an empire from the ground up, making decisions that shaped the financial landscape. Yet, in one fateful moment, a single glance would unravel the perfect world he had constructed. It all began one crisp evening when Ethan walked into La Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant. The shimmering crystal chandeliers above cast a soft glow across the room, and the subtle aroma of truffle butter and expensive wine filled the air. Ethan Grayson was no stranger to luxury, and tonight was no exception. With a casual yet deliberate motion, he adjusted his Rolex and held the door for Vanessa Carter, his new girlfriend, a model whose face adorned magazine covers across the world. Ethan was accustomed to being noticed, but tonight, something about the atmosphere felt different. The crystal chandeliers above, the finely set tables, and the glint of silver cutlery were all designed for one purpose: to impress. Vanessa, ever the showstopper in a sculpted red dress, leaned into him as she whispered, "It's perfect." He smiled, but not because he felt it. No, he smiled because that was what was expected, just like Vanessa at his side. She was a symbol, a piece of his perfect life, another trophy to show the world that he was a man who had everything. But Ethan's attention was diverted when he noticed something, or rather, someone in his peripheral vision. A waitress moved across the room, balancing a tray of elegant dishes with practiced grace. She had the softest features and deep brown eyes Ethan had once known better than his own. It was Clara Bennett, his ex-wife, but there was something different about her. Something that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. Beneath her black apron, Clara's once slender frame now carried the unmistakable sign of pregnancy, her belly, swollen and unmistakably full. His stomach churned as the truth hit him with the force of a punch. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had quietly disappeared from his life months ago, was pregnant. But not just pregnant, she was carrying a child. And Ethan realized with shock that he had never been told. The anger and confusion swirled within him, but he fought to keep his expression under control, not wanting to draw attention in the exclusive restaurant. Vanessa, lost in a conversation about a charity gala, hadn't noticed Ethan's sudden shift in mood. Forcing his gaze away from Clara, Ethan returned to the table. "I'm just going to the restroom," he muttered to Vanessa, who didn't even look up. As he moved through the restaurant, Clara glanced in his direction, and their eyes locked for a brief moment, just long enough for Ethan to see her surprise, her hesitation. She nearly dropped the tray she was carrying, but quickly regained composure, turning away to serve another table. But the damage had been done. Ethan's mind was racing. He intercepted her as she tried to make her way across the room. "Clara," he called, his voice low, almost dangerous. She stopped abruptly, her hand gripping the tray tighter, her eyes wary. "Mr. Grayson," she replied, her voice cool, detached. "Don't treat me like a stranger," he snapped, stepping closer. His gaze fell on her swollen belly, and he couldn't help himself. "Is that what I think it is?" Clara straightened, her face a mask of composure. "I don't know what you think, Ethan," she said, her voice even. He couldn't hold back his frustration. "You're pregnant. Why am I just finding out about this now?" Clara took a breath, steadying herself. "My condition has nothing to do with you," Ethan's anger flared. "This is absurd. If that baby is mine, I have a right to know." Clara didn't flinch. "This isn't a conversation we should be having here," she said quietly, her eyes hardening. Before Ethan could respond, She turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Back at the table, Ethan's mind was far from Vanessa's idle chatter. He couldn't focus on the discussion about the charity gala. Instead, he watched as Clara moved around the room, serving customers with a grace that contrasted sharply with the woman he once knew. She had changed. Her posture was weary, her eyes tired, but there was a resilience there that unsettled him. Clara was no longer the quiet, reserved woman who had once been lost in the shadows of his life. As the evening wore on, Ethan's thoughts spiraled out of control. He had to know the truth. What had happened? Why hadn't Clara told him about the pregnancy? His anger and confusion intensified as the evening wore on. He excused himself, barely listening to Vanessa as he muttered a half-hearted excuse. He needed answers and he would get them tonight. Later that night, after hours of pacing in his penthouse, Ethan called Clara's number. It rang and rang before finally going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message, but his thoughts were like a whirlwind, questions he couldn't answer, doubts that gnawed at him. The woman he had once dismissed was now carrying his child. His world, built on the certainty of control, was crumbling. Meanwhile, Clara, exhausted from her shift, sat in her modest apartment in Queens. She winced as she rested her hand on her swollen belly. The baby kicked, and Clara smiled, a small, sad smile. She knew Ethan would eventually find out. She had prepared herself for it, but nothing could prepare her for the wave of emotion that washed over her when their eyes met earlier that night. Anger, surprise, confusion, all of it mixed together. Clara's thoughts drifted back to their marriage. At first, she had admired Ethan's ambition, but over time, she had realized she would always come second. The idea of starting a family had seemed impossible, an idea that Ethan dismissed as absurd. He was too focused on his work. The idea of children, of a family, was just a dream she had quietly tucked away. And when she found out she was pregnant, it felt like a cruel joke. Their marriage was already hanging by a thread. Telling him would only complicate things more, so she left alone, carrying the burden of a decision she knew would change her life forever. The phone buzzed beside her, the name on the screen enough to make her stomach churn. It was Ethan. She ignored the call, squeezing her eyes shut as if she could block out the emotions that always surged when he was around. The next day, Ethan dug into Clara's life. His assistant had pulled up everything: the address in Queens, the name of the restaurant she worked at. But one detail, buried deep in the records, stopped him in his tracks. Clara hadn't asked for a single cent in the divorce settlement. No alimony, no financial support, nothing. It didn't make sense. Why hadn't she asked for anything? That night, Ethan found himself sitting at a table in La Lumiere, waiting for Clara to finish her shift. The quiet tension in the air thickened as their eyes met again. When she approached him, he could see the walls she had built around herself. "Can we talk now?" he asked, his voice more forceful than he intended. "I'm working," she replied, trying to walk away. "I'll wait," he said, his tone final. When the restaurant closed, they stepped outside into the cool night air. The streetlights bathed them in an eerie glow as Ethan confronted her. "Why didn't you tell me about the baby?" Clara took a deep breath, her face hardening. "Because you never wanted children. You made it clear that they weren't part of your plan." Ethan's face twisted in disbelief. "That wasn't your decision to make." Clara's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "I made that decision for myself, and for this child. I couldn't bring him into a life where he wasn't wanted." The words hit Ethan like a slap, but instead of anger, a strange sadness flooded him. For the first time, he realized how much he had hurt Clara, how much he had neglected her needs. "I deserve to know," he said, his voice quieter, but filled with emotion. "You took that from me." Clara met his gaze, her face unreadable. "You deserve many things, Ethan, but this child deserves even more." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, consumed by a storm of guilt and confusion. In the weeks that followed, Ethan became a man torn between his desire to control everything and his newfound understanding of what it meant to be present. He spent his days buried in work, but his nights were filled with thoughts of Clara and the child she had kept hidden from him. Despite her resistance, he was determined to be part of this child's life, even if it meant tearing down the walls he had so carefully constructed. It wasn't until one cold night, when Ethan received a frantic call from Clara's neighbor, that everything changed. Clara was sick, in pain, and refusing help. Ethan rushed to her side, determined to do whatever it took to make things right. The journey to the hospital was filled with tension, but when they arrived, the baby, premature and fragile, was born healthy. For the first time in years, Ethan stood by Clara's side, watching as she held their son, Liam, in her arms. Everything had changed. His world had shifted, no longer defined by his empire or his control over every detail. Instead, it was defined by a child he never thought he would have, and a woman who had silently carried a secret that would forever change them both. As the hospital lights dimmed and Clara looked at Ethan, her eyes softened. "You're here," she whispered. Ethan nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm here, Clara, and I'll never leave again." The man who once ruled everything with cold precision had finally found his humanity.